we invite Mr. Rory Weaver from
Thank you.
International Heritage Management course to give us an insightful presentation on approaches of heritage management in the kingdom. So, Rory, please.
Thank you. So I was originally going to do my presentation on legislation and heritage policy and legislation, but then I thought it might be better to take like a bit of a wider view and look at doing approaches to heritage management in the UK more generally. So how we look at managing our heritage because we've got so much of it. So today's presentation, I'm going to focus on different heritage organisations and different funding bodies in the UK. I'm going to focus on the big three, and I'm also going to focus on the HLF. Then I'm going to talk briefly about planning legislation, particularly in England. I'm not going to focus too much on Scotland and Wales because they have slightly different policies. Then I'm going to talk about how buildings are listed, the listing process in England, how it actually works, and how it's carried out by Historic England. And then I'm going to talk about problems with policy, so some loopholes that are still in the law, because our law isn't perfect, even though we like to think it is. And then I'm going to talk about the portable antiquity scheme, which is a really brilliant scheme to do with archaeology. And then I'm going to finally talk about the commercial archaeology sector in the UK and some sort of personal experience I've had with it whilst working with it after uni. So you can't really talk about heritage management in the UK without talking about the National Trust. It was founded in 1895 by a lawyer, a poet, and a social reformer. So it sounds like the beginning of a story already. And initially it was founded as a charity. It's a charitable organisation, but Parliament has considerable influence on how the National Trust runs, and it also has a lot of power as a charity, which is quite common in the UK in general. And once you donate a property to the National Trust, once you give your property to them, you can never get it back. It's in public trust forever, so you've lost it, or perhaps the public have gained it. And the Trust has 4.24 million members. It's one of the largest charities in the UK, and it has 6,000 paid staff and just over 62,000 volunteers working for them. So it's a big charity. And the Trust is also the largest private landowner. It has over 610,000 acres. So it really does have a lot of influence over the UK. And some examples of National Trust properties. One is Greenway in Devon. That's like quite close to my house. And my mum actually works there. And it's the former home of crime writer Agatha Christie. It's a beautiful Art Deco building, dated to the 1920s, 1930s. And it has lots of stately homes and country homes throughout the UK. That's what the National Trust is all about, really. But also the National Trust has a lot of coastline as well, which isn't that widely known. It also owns and protects 1/3 of the coastline between Devon and Dorset. And this beach is also fairly close to my house as well. So now moving on to English heritage. That's another one of the big three, really. Again, founded in the late 1800s. And at that stage, the heritage, responsibility of heritage was to do with the Office of Works. So this was a form of government and a government department. It was primarily responsible for architecture and built heritage. In 1913, this changed with an act that gave the office new powers. And essentially, they were supposed to build up a collection to talk about the national story of England, particularly. So it's kind of built on this rise of nationalism that we're starting to see before the turn of the First World War. And interestingly, prehistoric and medieval remains were given priority over country houses. And stately homes weren't really seen as heritage at that time, which is interesting to think of the differences between now, whereas you think of heritage and all you think of sometimes is a country estate, at least in England. This changed also during the Second World War. English heritage wanted to basically have properties that weren't just castles and fortresses. And the Treasury was very nervous of this, and they said basically no. And after a debate, it was decided it would be financially more sustainable if the National Trust took on country houses and the Ministry of Works took on older monuments. By 1970, part of the collection stood at 300 visited sites, and with more than 5.5 million people visiting them. And this was one of the biggest businesses in the UK. far outweighed many other tourist industries. In the 1980s, this changed under Margaret Thatcher, and the collection was renamed the more snappy English Heritage. And then, thanks to financial successes in the 80s, the government agreed that it would provide 80 million to English Heritage if it transferred the Heritage collection into a charitable trust. So again, it became a charity, much like National Trust. It separated in 2015, so one branch stayed English Heritage, looking after the collections, and one branch became Historic England. And that was interested in wider heritage, running the listing system, and dealing with planning matters and giving grants as well. So some English heritage properties. Again, we have huge castles like Dover Castle, used since the Iron Age, around 800 BC, all through to the Second World War as the first port of defence against German forces. But also English heritage has a number of battlefields and sites that aren't traditionally castles, such as Hadrian to Wall in the north of England, near the border with Scotland, built by the Romans and covering some of England's wildest landscapes and most beautiful bit of the country, really. So differences in membership. English Heritage has around 400 properties. National Trust has more than 300. And in terms of what you can get out of both membership, the National Trust perhaps offers more to its members. It has free entry to heritage organisations in 14 other Commonwealth countries, including Italy. One of the most famous English heritage sites is Stonehenge. It's probably the stereotypically English heritage site. But it has a lot of problems in terms of managing heritage. In terms of visitor flow, it gets annually anywhere between 25 to 1,000 to 1 million visitors per year, so it's huge. And in 2010, it was labelled a national disgrace by MPs because the road was basically too close to Stonehenge, and visitors were trampling all over it, in their words. And as you can see in the top part of the picture, the car park was really close to where Stonehenge is located. So this car park was removed. The road was pushed right back, and visitors were not allowed to go anywhere close to the stones. So you can see in the bottom picture, they're kept at a safe distance where they can't trample anything. And that's the site as it looks today. And Stonehenge, sorry, a bit of context, is a late Neolithic structure, 3,500 BC, part of the wider Wiltshire Neolithic landscape, full of beautiful Neolithic remains, such as long barrows, burial mounds, graves. So it's a beautiful part of the world. And then after this change, it was decided when the car park was removed that they'd build a new visitor centre. And this was carried out by an architect called Denton Corker Marshall for 27 million. And it was meant to be an unobtrusive kind of hub just outside of Stonehenge, where the gift shop would be, the restaurant, the cafe, the toilets, everything would be in one place. And the architecture was designed to be quite unobtrusive. It was not supposed to mimic at all stone, because the emphasis was supposed to be that only Stonehenge could be stone, if that makes sense. And also located just beside the building is some reconstructed Neolithic houses. So this was to promote engagement, and it's a great job. What they've done is they've constructed 3 buildings, Watland Daub, in the traditional Neolithic way, and they've reconstructed a hearth, a central hearth, and a lot of Neolithic artifacts where you can go in and sit and pretend to be a Neolithic person. So whilst that is great, commercialisation is also a massive problem at Stonehenge. It's been used primarily in advertisements a lot, such as the Shell advert for oil, the Temco signs in America. But also commercialisation can be seen in the Stonehenge gift shop. So you can even get Stonehenge sunglasses, Stonehenge mugs. Don't know why you'd want that, but you can if you want it. So whilst this is kind of understandable, is this part of financial revenue, or is this kind of cheapening heritage in some ways? Another one of the big 3 is Historic England. Historic England was created in 1983 by the National Heritage Act. And it exists primarily as a body of government. It controls primarily the listing system, how buildings are listed in the UK, well, in England specifically, sorry, not the UK. And in 2018 to 2019, that financial year, it was awarded 91.6 million in grant aid from the government. And similar to the KMC, it's run as a commission, so run by a commission, of 17 individuals, all deemed to be experts in their field. So architects, archaeologists, town planners, architects, said that. And there's 10 regional offices in the UK. So each region can have multiple counties. So my region in the southwest has Devon, Cornwall, Somerset, Dorset. So they cover a large area as well. It's also important to talk, when talking about heritage management, to kind of pick up on the Heritage Lottery Fund. This is the largest dedicated funder of heritage throughout the UK. So any group, small group or big group, can apply to the HLF for funding for their project that is directly related to heritage. They distribute the National Lottery grants from anywhere from 3,000 to 5 million. And the aim is to sustain and transform UK heritage. But the process is strict, and there's strict guidelines to applying. Whilst any group can apply, it's a long multi-stage process. So stage 1 is the development phase, and if you pass that, then you move on to stage 2, which is delivery grant request. But this requires a detailed activity plan. You need to have all your costings completely acquired for, which is understandable considering it's from the government. So some key factors that influence the planning process. Urbanisation is one. So rapid urbanisation is affecting the UK at a very fast rate, as it's affecting many locations in the world. And it's forcing planning policy to be more flexible. Industrialisation is also encroaching on what was once green space and rural land, meaning that legislation has to keep up with a changing environment. Weathering also affects historic property, as seen by the public, and the methods of construction have to account for a changing climate and increase of damaging weathering. Human agency is also really important in the planning process, which is perhaps more unusual to some other planning processes that are more rigid. In the English system, there's much more flexibility in terms of the decision maker. Thanks, Austin. And how much the influence they have over law. So this comes the kind of dry bit of the presentation. Legislation. So one of our key laws is the Planning Act of 1990. This covers conservation areas and listed buildings. And this sets out the legislative framework affecting listed buildings and conservation areas primarily. And so the law states that any works for the demolition of a listed building or its alteration or extension in any manner which would affect its character as a building of special architectural or historic interest development which affects a listed building or its setting. The local planning authority, or as the case may be the Secretary of State, have special regard to the desirability of preserving the building or its setting or any features of special architectural or historic interest which it possesses. So it's quite a lengthy lot of paragraphs. So as I said before, interpretation and subjectivity are key to the legal system in England. And that is one of our cultures of the English legal system. Discretion equals more flexibility, but less market certainty. So investors don't know exactly what they're going to get from if a building is being modified in any way. And the subjectivity of the decision maker is really key in a lot of English legislation. So the listing process in England, as I said before, is carried out by Historic England, and they list buildings actually as heritage assets instead of just buildings. So we have 3 grades. Grade 1 is for the building of highest significance. So these are buildings that we deem culturally to be very important. Then there's grade 2 star, which is particularly important buildings of more than special interest. And then there's grade 2, buildings that are of special interest. And 92% of all buildings in the UK fall into that category, fall into grade 2. And Historic England, as I said, lists these as heritage assets and puts them on something called the Heritage at Risk Register. I don't know if that's visible too much. So there's just over 5,600 heritage assets on the list as of 2014. But as you can see, it's not just buildings, it's scheduled monuments, conservation areas, parks and gardens, wrecks, battlefields, and UNESCO World Heritage Sites. So they have a lot to account for. Now the picture might not come up, yeah, it hasn't come up too well at all. But this is a case in Bristol recently. This is a case where a developer wanted to change a 17th century Jacobean building. And he basically wanted to make it into student flats for Bristol University. And he wanted to gut the building, take the ceiling down, which was a beautiful ceiling. And he managed to get away with it because the building wasn't listed. An emergency appeal was put in to get the building listed, but because it wasn't put in time, he managed to completely destroy the building and destroy the historic integrity of it. And what this proves is that there's still loopholes in our system. It's not completely perfect in any way. And it proves that unfortunate loss of historic fabric is still possible in our law. Whilst that might be the case, there's also a lot of positives happening in the UK at the moment. So the Portable Antiquity Scheme is probably one of these. It really tries to make archaeology accessible to the public and is based on the Treasure Act of 1996. And it's run by the British Museum and the National Museum of Wales to encourage the recording of archaeological objects, particularly in England and Wales. And it's basically to get metal detectorists, dog walkers, people that are just finding objects on the floor, to go to their museums, take the objects there, and actually help them record these artifacts. And so how the Portable Antiquity Scheme works is that each region has a finds liaison officer. So each county will have a finds liaison officer. There'll be one for Devon, there'll be one for Cornwall, etc. And the metal detectorists, or the people that find a hoard of objects, go to these find liaison officers, and they give them the objects with the opportunity of being paid back a certain amount of money for whatever they find. But they have quite a strict definition of what constitutes treasure. So it's quite long, but they say that any metallic object other than a coin provided at least 10% of weight by metal is precious metal, i.e. gold or silver, and that it is at least 300 years old when found. If the object is of prehistoric date, it will be a treasure provided any part of it is precious metal. Any group or two or more of metallic objects of any composition of prehistoric date that come from the same find, and then two or more coins of the same find provided they're at least 300 years old when found and contain 10% of gold or silver. And any object that is found in relation to these in the same context is automatically considered treasure. So the main aims of the scheme are to promote maximum public interest and benefit from the recovery, recording and research of portable antiquities. It's also to promote best practice by finders and landowners and archaeologists and museums in the discovery, recording and conservation of finds by the public. But the aim is to get stronger partnerships between museums and local groups and communities, but also to increase awareness in young people as well of the amazing archaeology that is quite literally in the ground beneath their feet. And it's to create those partnerships and increase participation in archaeology. So what's expected of the staff is they are expected to maintain an online database where they record all the finds and use it for educational or research purposes. They're also meant to hold outreach events such as find days, either at museums or in public, and attend local metal detecting clubs and give talks to national and local groups. And they're supposed to facilitate the finds of that are recorded in the scheme in museums and elsewhere. And after this, they're supposed to publish an annual report and other publications in print. So I talked about it a bit briefly, but the commercial archaeology sector in the UK is growing at a really fast rate. But it's worth talking about the difference between commercial archaeology and research archaeology, because in the UK they are different. So commercial archaeology is primarily to do with development. So any new building project has to get an archaeology company in, a private archaeology company in, to assess the ground, to do surveys, and to do excavation if necessary. Whereas research archaeology has primarily academic research aims. They're not doing it for a financial goal, whereas the commercial groups definitely are. So I worked for Archaeology Wales at the top, straight after university. And as you can see just on this picture, there's lots of different companies. This is just a snapshot of how many there are, but there's hundreds in the UK, all competing for different contracts. Mostly the contracts are small, but sometimes they can run over many years. So Archaeology Wales was subcontracted to Cotswold Archaeology, that was subcontracted to Wool Armstrong, that was subcontracted to a big energy company. So there's lots of kind of interaction between lots of different companies. So the current state of the commercial archaeology market is that there's more people working as commercial archaeologists than ever before. And the market does continue to mostly revolve around residential development, followed by transport, energy, and commercial and industrial development. As I said, the sector is very different from commercial archaeology in the sense that it's to do with financial aims. So archaeology is kind of growing in terms of its significance in the media, particularly in the UK. It's being talked about quite a lot. So at the moment there's lots of developments going on, such as HS2. We're trying to build a better infrastructure in the UK. That's probably going to increase with Boris Johnson talking about nationalism. So lots more archaeology is kind of making its way into the mainstream. It's making its way into news articles quite a lot. And this is a site I worked on in Suffolk. We found a Neolithic ritual site. We didn't quite stumble upon it. We did pretty precise surveys, so we knew it was there. But yeah, it was actually older than Stonehenge, which was quite interesting. It was about 1,000 years previous to Stonehenge, which was quite cool. And it was a Neolithic wooden trackway. So basically, that was a wooden bridge in the top of a ditch that was preserved almost perfectly in peat, to do with the acidity of the soil. And that's one of the stakes that was hand carved by a Neolithic person 5,000 years ago. Yeah. So lots of TV programs are coming up about archaeology, such as Digging for Britain with Dr. Alice Roberts. In that program, they almost exclusively focus on commercial archaeology projects, which is kind of unusual. That's not really talked about up until now. And it's actually a really interesting program if you want to watch it. And there's lots of magazines in the UK coming up about archaeology, such as Current Archaeology with the face of Richard III, or half the face of Richard III. And it's making its way into sort of public consciousness more and more. So archaeology in the UK is not just seen as like an add-on, it's seen as a viable career option. As I said before, development isn't seen as opposed to archaeology or heritage, it's seen as part of it, which is quite different to what I've experienced here in terms of how Indian policy approaches heritage. And the number of UK and foreign graduates going into the field straight after university is increasing. A lot of my friends went straight from their undergraduate into commercial fieldwork. And the net number of people working in professional UK archaeology grew by 8.9% in 2017. So some conclusions, I've finished a bit quickly, but so the decision-making process in the UK planning is not prescriptive and relies on the decision maker interpreting legislation, policy and guidance and applying it to the particulars of a case. In many ways our system is very flexible, but in some ways that can also be a negative. If a building isn't listed, it can fall through the cracks of the system and completely be destroyed, as the Bristol case study showed. Discretion obviously results in more flexibility in terms of the types of developments that are built as well. Heritage management is beginning in the UK to be viewed in a holistic way, but that doesn't mean we're there yet. There's still lots more work to be done in terms of that. I've said before, development doesn't have to stand in the way, but that is not to say that UK policies are perfect. And overall, there is a greater awareness of heritage sites, but that can also lead to greater commercialisation, as seen at Stonehenge. And whether that's a problem or not depends on your viewpoint and depends on your background. But finding that appropriate balance is probably key to the future of heritage management in the UK. And that's me, done.